So in order to find a multi-provider object, instead of looking through all these different info areas for one, we can just go up here to the Find. We'll select the type that we want to look for, multi-provider. And because we're not sure which one we're looking for, we can just put an asterisk, and it's going to scan the system for all the info providers that are currently in BW. And here they are. So if we expand this, we can see what's inside the multi-provider. And what I mean by what's inside, it's actually a view. So the multi-provider doesn't store any data. It just stores the SQL that pulls from these two info cubes, which contain the actual data. So when you're building your query, it's a best practice to point those to multi-providers, because this technical name probably isn't going to change, but the data down here is. So if you add C04, you don't have to update this guy up here where your query is pointing to. It automatically gets that new data. Multi-providers can contain a variety of different info provider types. So it can house any of these guys. Obviously not a multi-provider because it is one, but it can hold the info set, the cube, the DSO, the master data bearing info object. You can have all those. So if you want to have all those under one umbrella, you would use a multi-provider. And in my experience, multi-providers are very helpful for separating out your data in a process called partitioning, which separates it like by calendar year. So if you have financial information, let's say like a net sales info cube for 2010 through 2015, all in one info cube, it's going to be massive. If you break it out by year, 2010, and then create a new info cube, put a filter on that DTP, and just pull out the data from 2011, put it in its own info cube here called 2011, and do the same thing for the subsequent years, 2012, 13, 14, and 15. And then you can just drop the data from that big fat info cube. And all your reports, when your users query, will now be hitting this multi-provider. And based on the calendar year the person's running, SAP knows exactly what info cube to look at. So instead of going through all of those info cubes, or the big fat one at once, it can just target that data immediately. And instead of looking through 1 billion records, it's only looking through 1 million records. So the time savings are tremendous when you use multi-providers and partitioning in accordance with them. You can also use info sets. So multi-providers do unions. Info sets are for joining. So if you're missing some data in one info provider, but want it in another one, use an info set. So I'll double click into this info set. Select the network display. We can see that it's kind of similar to a transformation screen where you're connecting objects. So there's data in this DSO 06 and there's data in this DSO 10. So they're both linked on company code. So you're performing a join and it's consolidating data from both of these objects. So 10 and 6. Info sets aren't that great performance-wise, so I really wouldn't recommend them. I would make sure you structure your data in such a way that when you're pulling it into BW, it's already optimized to be either accessible by using a multi-provider, so you're not really doing any joins inside of BW. But if you absolutely have to do some joins in BW, the info set's the way to go. And much like the multi-provider, the info set doesn't actually store data. It just stores a SQL to run that join. So at runtime, if you're querying this particular info set, it's going to do a select statement on both of these DSOs based on the company code that the user had searched for. And BW 7.3 introduced a couple of new different info provider types. So if I just right click on this info area, we can see that there's the hybrid provider, composite provider. And inside of the info cube, we create one, or there's a new status called info cube only stores data inside of BWA. So BWA is, I'm sure you've heard of HANA. It's basically the grandfather of HANA. It allows you to index data inside of your info cube into memory. So it takes a copy of this particular info cube, ZIC_DEMSC, throws that into, let's think of it like a cloud. So you upload this info cube into a cloud that's stored on memory versus the database or the hard disk. So whenever the user runs the query on this particular info cube, it goes to that cloud-like memory database. The only pain point is you have to then update that in-memory BWA every time you load new data into this info cube. So the load process would be, so run your info package, pull that data into the PSA, load that data into a DSO. Obviously there's not one in this data flow, but that's what you would normally do. Then load that data from the DSO into the info cube. So, back in the year 2005, or whenever the BWA didn't exist, that's as high as it can go. And, no matter what, if your performance sucked, it sucked. You could do a redesign, or a couple of years later, BWA came out, you could simply copy all of your data from this info cube into the in-memory appliance, BWA, Business Warehouse Accelerator, and now reporting would be lightning fast. So 2 seconds versus 10 minutes or so. And that's the benefit of BWA. It's very expensive, but it's worth it if you have a data warehouse that's gotten so slow and you've already optimized your performance. You've tuned everything at the database level on the front end as well, and you're still not getting the results you would like. Look into the BWA. And the transaction for BWA is RSDDB. So BWA index maintenance. So we would type in our info cube. So Z test cube. This doesn't exist, but just for example's sake, you hit create, and then a job runs that then pushes all the data from the database into the in-memory appliance, BWA. And we can see that the system doesn't have a BWA installed. And another BWA transaction is /n to get a new session, and RSDDBIA mon 2. Okay, and this is where you would monitor the BWA if it was installed. Another transaction is Trex admin. This is the administrator backend of BWA. And we probably won't be able to see anything because we can't connect to the BWA appliance if it doesn't exist. But you would essentially type in the RFC destination for that particular BWA and then hit run. And then it would connect to the BWA and you could view all sorts of details. Another object that's out there is the virtual provider. It's similar to the multi-provider and InfoSet that it doesn't actually store any data. So at runtime, it executes the transformation in DTP, but doesn't actually store the data inside of itself, like the InfoCube or DSO do. So how is SAP HANA different from BWA? SAP HANA actually replaces the existing database. So everything that you have on BW would be in memory versus selectively adding things into BWA in order to optimize their read performance. Where HANA shines is both when reading and writing to objects. Because the whole database is happening in memory, the disk has been removed from the equation, so as soon as you load data into BW, it's automatically optimized to be reported off of. And that's why HANA is so special. There's not that big of a difference between a system running on BW on your standard database versus running on HANA. other than extremely fast performance pretty much on all aspects of loading and reading of data. So if you can afford HANA, go for it. And just to show you an example of what I mean, so DBA cockpit, which is the database administration area of BW. So it's showing us that the database we're currently running is a Microsoft SQL Server. We can see stats on this particular installation, how much space we have left. So if you're a DBA, a database administrator, you would probably be in this transaction quite often, reviewing different tables, table spaces that you have created, and running just maintenance. One more thing that I wanted to mention is the BI content. So you go down here to BI content. This is where we can install content that SAP has provided to us for our usage. So they've already created a standard set of different objects that you might be using, in the oil industry or in the retail industry. And all you're doing is activating these objects, and then you can immediately use them. A lot of people don't use these because you have to customize so much for your own installation, but you can see here that SAP provides all these different things. So financial management, financial supply chain, biller direct, cash and liquidity management. As we expand this, we're going to see the BW objects that they provided for us. So all these info cubes, they're already configured to use these multi-providers. And to activate this BI content, all you're going to be doing is going up to the top level, either dragging and dropping, or clicking on the Insert Objects for Collection. That's fine. Okay, so it took a little while. Basically, we dragged over this info area, and all the objects that are associated with this info area, all the way down, can now be added to our BW environment because they're not installed currently. So right now it's only installing, so active version available, these top three. So if we want to do everything, click this top level box. Well, I think these are actually already installed in our environment. That's why they're showing up as green. So what we would do is click on the install. You could simulate it to see how long it would take. You could just install it in dialog, which is, in this current screen, so it would lock up our session. Or you can install it in background, which will then schedule a job to kick off and run in the background, pretty much. So we won't be able to see what's going on as far as what's process is, unless we look at the job log. So if we want to do that, we can just install in background. So right now it's probably scheduling the job. So if we go to, yep, okay. The job was scheduled. Click the green check, okay. Now let's go to transaction SM37 to view the log. So let's look at the active jobs. I'll put an asterisk here, so it's going to show environment-wide what jobs are running. And this is my user ID. The jobs are running for 22 seconds. And if we want to see some details on this job, we just click on the job name, click on the log, and we can see that this program is currently running with this variant for my user. And if you have experience in SAP, you'll understand programs and variants. But for BW, you really don't need to know much about programs or variants at all. That's more of the ABAP landscape and the ECC side. We can refresh. And again, this might take a few minutes to a few hours, depending upon the size of the BI content that's being installed. But basically, once this job runs successfully, we go into RSA1, and all of those info providers, so those cubes we saw before, would now be available to us. And that's the beauty of BI content. It just works right out of the box.